I assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
My talk, the title is, you can see right there, Reflections on the Latinoamericanization of Race, which is a concept that has been already used, and the Latinoization of Politics, another concept that has also been really used. What I'm doing is trying to connect them in some way and also reflect on them in contemporary United States. And subtitle is Significance, but it would have been too long if I put it there. And the relevance for building multi-ethnic alliances in the 21st century. So, we are gathered here today to reflect about the meaning, significance, and possibilities of multi-ethnic coalitions in the 21st century. This activity requires looking closely at resources and challenges that we have inherited from the past, an acute observation of our present questions and concerns, and a sober look into the future. When we look at our immediate present and gaze at our future, it is very difficult to evade the questions of the presence and political role in the United States of the so-called Latino and Latina population. Some of them came here as immigrants, many others were swallowed in by the imperial ambitions of this country. There were also others who crossed the borders with hope of finding a better life and found themselves exposed to the most virulent racism here. In the last 2 months, and especially in the last 2 weeks, we have seen a demonstration of the kind of debates and mobilizations that will become more present in the 21st century in this country. The white establishment has already realized the quote-unquote challenge that the multiplication of immigrants from Mexico and Latin America has for their hegemony and the traditional way of life in this country. They know of it because of the growing Spanish TV and radio stations, because of the market targeting Latinas and Latinos, the dependence of certain industries of low-paid work on recent immigrants and others, and because of census statistics and estimates that indicate that Latinas and Latinos will likely constitute from 1/4 to half of the population in this country sometime in the next 50 years, thus rendering whites a minority in this country for the first time in its history. Well, not for the first time in its history, since it became a nation, right? What is the establishment then doing to deal with this so-called challenge that they have realized that is so patent to them, and I think it will increasingly become very clear to many sectors in this country? First, they have done many things. One of them was to militarize the border, and that still continues to happen. But the failure of this strategy, again, it continues to happen, has led to the proposition of an even more brutal proposition, the criminalization of those who make it into this country without official documentation, and of those who help them or befriend them, including clergy, family, and employers. It was in large part this excess from the part of the government and the establishment that mobilized millions of people into the streets less than 2 weeks ago in protests, and thousands of them before that. White academics with nativist views had already sounded the alarm about the kind of challenges that would likely increase for mainstream white America in the 21st century. Harvard professor and international studies scholar Samuel Huntington raised the alarm very loudly with his essay in Foreign Affairs entitled The Hispanic Challenge, and in his book, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. Huntington lends social science rhetoric to raising the alarm about the increase of the Spanish-speaking population in the US and their potential effect in eroding the language, the religion, and the political values that for him are central to the United States and largely responsible, allegedly, for its success as a nation and as an international superpower. In his book, Hispanics appear as an internal cultural terrorist of sorts that menace the pillars of the nation. And I think many of you are acquainted with the book, so I'm not going to go over it, but I would like to say an anecdote that perhaps will be illuminating. And I had the opportunity to actually be in a debate with him in a panel. It was Alain Touraine, Huntington, and myself, and Touraine and myself were were engaging critically his book, Who Are We? From two different positions, of course. He, from a sort of French republicanism, I think at the end lingers ideas of equality and so on that are threatened by this more communitarian nativist view that Huntington is nationalistic is putting together. I myself from more a decolonial and theorizing that owes affinities to many third world scholars in the third world and also in the United States. But what was very interesting there is that I was consciously playing my presentation with the concept of challenge, right? He said to clarify the challenges to American national identity. And I sometimes purposely use a menace, right? The menace of people, of Latinos and Latinas. And I think I throw it one time and I put qualifiers because I knew that obviously there is a difference. The notion of challenge is ambiguous, right? And it points to the menace, but it doesn't quite say so yet, right? But I think it's there in the background of the book, but it's never said. It's never said exactly in the book that Latinos or Latinas are a menace for US national culture. But one of the things that I pointed out towards the end of my paper was that Latinos and Latinas should not be looking to dream the American or the so-called Americano dream, that rather they should put themselves in a position of asking, given that whites and so many other Anglos in the United States are now acquainted with some Spanish words like ay caramba, que bueno, and things like that, right? That one very usual, very important word for them to learn would be estadounidense, right? Estadounidense, that denotes the particularity of the United States instead of referring to people from this country as Americans. And it's very difficult for people from Latin America or the Caribbean, for instance, to refer to people from the United States as purely Americans. So there is a word in Spanish that could help to bring some sense of humility into that sense of self-identification. So I was making that point. I was not thinking that Spanish is somehow, that Latinos should force everyone to learn Spanish or anything like that. It's only, here is a term that may help you to dislocate your sense of identity, to reformulate another more dialogical, perhaps, sense of who you are in relation to others in the hemisphere. Interesting enough, when he responded among the different criticisms that I did, and I made others which were really strong, this was not a criticism, this was just a proposal. He said towards the end, well, Professor Maldonado sometimes referred to my position in terms of a menace, that I said that Latinos are a menace, but indeed that's not so. I quite consciously used challenge, but after hearing what he said at the end, this issue of Latinos now asking Anglos to somehow change their habits of thinking. Now, I must confess that that was my fear. That was my fear, and that if that's so, they are indeed a menace. And well, you know, he was at that point a little bit tired, of hearing so many criticism. So at that point, he also had to catch a plane. So he basically closed everything and said, well, then I'm going to Harvard now, I'm going to Boston. I will be thinking very hardly about this in my way there. And then he stomped out and, he left everyone race. I mean, actually, I was a little distracted when he was talking. I mean, just thinking about myself, listening. But it was the eyes of the audience who told me what he had just said and confessed in front of everybody. Eyes, everyone really was in shock. And then he left, and the environment was really very, difficult afterwards. And there was Craig Calhoun was the moderator, and, he has some comments about it. But it was a really chilling confession, I think. And I've been thinking recently about that episode because he was so shocked, right, by only suggesting that Anglos should learn one word. And then recently with the anthem sung in Spanish, I think he may be just, and these marches occupying the streets by millions, people like him at this point right now, I'm sure they are just, I mean, it's one word set him off like that. I don't know what, but he may not be sleeping well, something, surely must be going on. But it's going. And you know what? That they take it very seriously. And that's the issue. They take it all these things very seriously. And they say just like that, okay, now even in the plane I will be thinking about that, right? And I think that tells us a little about how serious we also have to be with our positions, our commitments. We have to respond with the same, in the same kind of way and with the same kind of urgency. Well, in part what he's responding to is something like this. And this is from the cover of a book that came out in Argentina. Just, this is the exportation of theory from the United States to Latin America, but theory already in dialogue with Latin America. That's why they are interested in it. And there are two essays there, but I want you to focus on the picture, of course. And this is by Peter Lash, right? And that will be the cover in all the volumes that are published in this series. Now, there you have it. It's Latino America. It's sort of a different geography. Shall introduce us as cartographers here. So in this way, this points to a new cartography. But of course, when people like Huntington see this, they are completely scandalized. But that's the issue. And I think that if we're going to talk about multi-ethnic coalitions in the 21st century, we have to look at this and think about this very strongly and carefully. What are the possibilities, problems, challenges that come with this new reality? So in that line, I would like to point out that, and the responses to this and what is coming out of this is, for instance, HR 4437. The anthem in Spanish, our response, and the marches are the beginning of what is coming as the United States appears each time more like this map, but trying to resist it by all means. There are many whose ideas of what is to come is based solely on numbers or the quantity of Latino and Latina migration, as if numbers alone were to change the dynamics of power in this country, which is, of course, not true. We often forget that anti-black and anti-indigenous racism, for instance, are not equivalent to white supremacy. That is, blacks and indigenous peoples can continue to be racialized by other forms of supremacy, be brown or mestizo or whatever. It is not precisely the case what happens in many parts of Latin America. That is, different forms of mestizo supremacy dressed as racial democracies, where radical marginalization of indigenous and blacks is seen as a problem of class but not of race, where racism supposedly does not exist there, while colorblind racism represents, in some ways, part of a post-1960s racial project in the United States. In Latin America, it has in some way existed for about 400 years. Or at least, not 400 years, but much longer than here, at least from the beginning of the nation almost. In Latin America, different sophisticated forms of denying race while sustaining it brutally and radically are integral to the very image of the different nations. While Huntington concerns, and actually tell me my students that, if the US strategists would learn a lot of how to reconfigure race in the United States just by looking at Latin America, that will be another way, right? That they could obtain many, many sources. And they probably begin to do it. While Huntington concerns lie in Mexicans and other Hispanics becoming a menace to the nation, I think that we should be more concerned in recent migrants becoming instrumental in forging new forms of racism in this country, importing, as it were, centuries-old racial conceptions and ideas from the South to the North. This adds another layer of complexity to what Eduardo Silva Bonilla Silva has called the Latinoamericanization of race in the United States. Not everything that goes from the north, I would say, to the south is bad, of course, like the methodologies and the colonial theories that we produce here, and not everything that comes from the south to the north is good either. What I wish is to be realistic and sober, not to provide the means for a different form of hysteria about migrants from Mexico and Latin America. For while many of them are bringing their own forms of racism, which could reinforce and modify for the worst those in this country, at the same time the confrontation with poverty and racism can dramatically change these postures or provide the opportunity for such radical change. The consciousness of recent poor migrants can easily go from ambition and admiration of Anglo-whiteness or the American dream, to offense and indignity for white treatment and white supremacy, to exposure of different political alternatives voiced by other Latinas and Latinos, to changes motivated by interaction with other supporters or by detractors. In this sense, I believe that the marches that happened 2 weeks ago represent not necessarily an unambiguous attempt to decolonize radically the United States or the US empire, but at least the condition and possibility of larger debates within the Latina and Latino community about how to respond to the insults of mainstream or right-wing Anglo-whites as they respond to the Hispanic, so-called Hispanic challenge. We should not forget that while many recent migrants can come seeking for some kind of assimilation, that not all of them do, even when they sometimes use pro-American discourse. Second, that while sheer numbers do not automatically bring progressive changes, their numbers do force certain conflicts in the public arena, and they promote political discussions among Latinas and Latinos and others. Third, that some of the poor migrants are not only workers, but have also been organizers in their countries of origin, and that they are bringing with them different traditions of radicalism. And this is what has been, Roberto Lobato has called the Latinoization of politics in the US. The importation not of racism, but the importation of these different strategies and technologies of opposition to racism and to different forms of supremacy. Fourth, that long before many of them arrive, here, Chicanas and Chicanos and others had traditions of organizing in these countries, including other non-Spanish-speaking, non-Latinos and non-Latinas, and that they are still alive. And in these marches, they go to the streets. They are not only stay at the university, they go to the streets. So there is the marches, at the very least, are being a space for the possibility of democratization and exposure to these radical ideas and these legacies that we have here. Not only we have farms, but also, let's say, farms of radical activism, of radical ideas. That the marches are occurring, fifth, at the same time that leftist movement and leadership are acquiring strength in Latin America, from Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, Chile to Ecuador and beyond. And in that sense, I think it will be interesting to contrast when we look at, for instance, Asian American migration that we were hearing this morning, and Latino migration, that while countries like India, for instance, are experiencing a boom, economic, financial boom by some sectors that are getting access to the capitalist infrastructure, that right now in Latin America, out of the crisis of the 1990s and of the different neoliberal projects, what we are seeing emerging is something quite the opposite, right? A strong leftist articulation, and that has to do, I think, with what these migrants will do and what Latinos and Latinas here, from where they will get inspiration and so on. That's a possibility also. So it seems to me that this entire general background is most relevant to the topic of building multi-ethnic coalitions today, and particularly to the question of how ethnic studies and related programs should define themselves as they look forward to the already begun 21st century. I like to think that ethnic studies, and I'm going to read it slowly, I would like to think that ethnic studies and related fields emerged out of the vision and commitment of young people, and that the main purpose was not only to create new scholarship, but to create an institutional space where other young people could come to achieve the same degree and the same kind of radical consciousness, the same vision and the same commitment that the most radical and visionary figures among them in other communities throughout the world facing the same challenges and throughout history had. So it's a place to come, as it were, to take the blue pill. Was it the blue or the red pill in the Matrix, remember? They wanted to make sure that there was a place, an institution already, as part of an institution, where that was possible, for people to reach the same kind of vision of the problems and of the possibilities that were to come. And I think that we shall forth of our efforts if we do less than that. And we owe it to them to do that and more. Students sometimes complain, though, that we are most of the time teaching them about the many ways in which communities of color suffer. But our mission should be one of opening up possibility. And to open up possibility, I think that we need to, very briefly, one, and you know all this, I'm just putting an emphasis, reach across communities and generations. If colonization and racism seek to close the avenues of interhuman contact, we shall seek to open them and generate theories and pedagogies that cement such gestures, that make them possible. Second, emphasize the importance of time and history, both of pre-colonial time and time after colonization and through colonization. Third, emphasize the importance of space and place, knowing the relevance of the local, the national, the regional, the global, but also of the difference between secular space and sacred space, as it has been pointed out by Native American scholars. And fourth, see theory itself as a form of activism and create links between the academy as an institution and communities and also social movements. As part of this, engaging in a form of, and I call it partly epistemic coyotism. Epistemic coyotism, where we function as epistemic coyotes, bringing the colonial theories and forms of practices from the South and other places to the desert of our academic institution. Another image is that of the epistemic bandido, let's say, trafficking theory, bringing theory through the border, through the closed walls, making sure that these ideas keep transiting towards our space and our institutions. I think that all these things rate very highly in what we are trying to do, for instance, at Berkeley in the Department of Ethnic Studies, and we have had different events, from events on Latinos and Latinas in the world system, where we brought up Afro-Latinos, Latinos of indigenous origin, and we actually even question that Latinos is a proper term to refer to many of them who actually resist the term, and we also brought folks from the African diaspora and indigenous peoples themselves to have a conversation about what possibly to do together in the 21st century, to begin to think now and not to wait to 50 years from now about strategies to mobilize in an effective way. Also, we have had meetings about Zapatismo and indigenous women's movement in Mexico, about Chicana theory. And I think that ultimately this image about, the Zapatista wall being broken down, there are other metaphors and ideas and images that we can incorporate, like for instance, this bridge called My Back, right? Where instead of a wall, we need to put a bridge, and a bridge with our bodies, with our back if possible. That's an image that comes from Chicana feminism. And like that, there are so many other metaphors and ideas that I think could become central to the activity of ethnic studies. And I truly think that ultimately, we can do better and stronger if we work with others and join forces, and that we can reach higher, I think, both inside and outside. I think that we still have a lot to do in the university, in the institutions, in terms of transformations and demands that have not been done, and that the people who were behind this were not about to create only departments of ethnic studies, but whole college of third world college. So I think we have to come back also to those ideas. And as we also try to link with communities, with people, also think about further transformations in the university. We also need new symbols and signs, like this one, that should probably become one of our main symbols as we transit different, the hierarchies of the administration in the university, to say that no nos van a parar ni aquí ni allá. Thank you.
What I'm going to do today is just is kind of roughly 3 parts. One is to kind of talk about what ethnic studies has meant to me as a scholar. Secondly, to talk a little bit about some of the new directions of my work. And then third, I want to do a little bit of reflection on this particular symposium and what it means to be talking in a critical way about ethnic studies in the 21st century. So, One of my family's great unofficial games often took place coming home from church services on Sunday afternoons. For my father, a Reformed church minister, and my mother, Sunday morning was always a feverish moment of the week. My dad deliberately ambling about the house or apartment, obviously nervous about his sermon. My mom spending an hour in the shower, clearly nervous about dad's anxieties. Many Sunday mornings I was awoken by my parents bickering at each other, barely hushed Korean speak that they thought my brother and I couldn't hear. But by church's end, there was in the family Oldsmobile a sense of relief that was measured by the cheerful, gossipy talk that my parents would engage in about the latest impropriety of one of the parishioners. It would be during these late afternoons on Sunday jammed Northern Boulevard or the Long Island Expressway that our car sometimes crept next to another car full of Asian-looking people. My parents' chat would pause briefly, my brother and I would stop yelling at each other in the back seat, and we'd all look port or starboard side. For a brief moment, probably no more than 5 seconds, there'd be silence in the car, save the humming of the engine, but we all knew what the silence meant. Finally, almost always, my mother would break the seemingly solemn moment and blurt out what all four of us had in our minds. 한국 사람이야? Which roughly translated would go, "Hey, I wonder if they're Korean." And almost always, we could see that the occupants of the other car were staring right back at us, the kids' noses pressed against the windshield, the adults staring just a little too long for American comfort. So powerful is this desire to be recognized as socially significant by recognizing another as oneself, that it can sometimes occlude the larger determining forces that animate the gesture towards the window, the muffled silence that barely conceals the blurt of correspondence. They are like me. You belong here, you must belong, or you must go is a concluding refrain in Chang Rui-Li's widely celebrated first novel, Native Speaker. The terrible and terrifying imperative of U.S. assimilation that, for the promises of future success, demands of its immigrants the bleak fascism of uniform universalism now. We bristle at the provincial self-segregation of looking for our own kind. We wonder why the kids of color sit at the same table at schools, and if we are Walter Ben Michaels, we view such multicultural practice as the beginning of the end of American civitas. But rather than viewing such social clumping as intellectual mistakes, perhaps a more productive means of analysis is to ask what is at stake in this social activity, right or wrong. For far from being an a priori principle of social formation, the desire to see oneself in another, to be seen by another by a particular axis of identity, is an ethical response to the condition of alienation that perhaps is a mark of anyone's fundamental humanity, but that those geographically displaced, culturally unmoored, and spiritually detached feel most acutely. Is it any wonder then that ethnic studies has been generally imagined the search for what Vijay Prashad refers to as something of a horizontal assimilation, with others also injured by the term set by white supremacy? Should it be surprising that we in ethnic studies seek to find bonds and attachment that exceed the language of scholarly affiliation and institutional sanction? The work of ethnic studies is nothing more than telling stories through the fictions of race, the great story of the United States that socially binds us as tightly as it enables. Ethnic studies is nothing less than the crucial acknowledgement that damage doesn't just produce victimization only, but also the capacity, the urgency to, as John Edgar Wideman puts it, to start a story so that an old story can end. Literary scholars attentive to the power of the word know all too well how stories are complicit in justifying human suffering that are sadly all too imaginable. To this extent, ethnic studies scholars are fully aware of the caveat of criticism, best summed up by that severe poet and critic Ivor Winters, and he says, to protect us from something we have been foolish enough to love. We are foolish enough to love the narratives and to see ourselves in those narratives that produce all kinds of human vulnerabilities that have led to countless premature deaths for the benefit of some communities over others. Still, we write in order to listen. We look out the window to recognize ourselves in someone else. We engage in our foolish criticism since we are still foolish enough to love that which we should be protected from. We are unafraid of this foolishness because it is also the beginning of critical wisdom. In a descriptive sense, we are wild readers, readers who write beyond and sometimes against tolerable protocols and are often viewed as crazy. An intellectual insanity in no small measure and at least a partial result of intolerable regimes of power power and the people in and with power who wield it in the security of gates and borders. And in our critical craziness, and critical craziness is a term that's been wonderfully fleshed out by my friend and colleague Lisa Kachuk, who will be speaking tomorrow, and I hope you go and see her, she's great. In our critical craziness, we look to those in the shadows who might offer the brief solace that they forged a path of resistance to power that may or may not be usable models, but are at the very least inspiring figures of a different kind of cultural logic. But there's danger in what we do. The kernel of my first book took place in my senior year in college. Why, I asked Herman Beavers, one of the first and few African American faculty members in the English department who unequivocally supported Asian American studies at my school, why, I asked, are so many Asian American writers gaining critical and popular acclaim now in the midst of the Reagan-Bush 1 years? Why now and not before? Is there a connection? I don't know, Professor Beavers responded. I suppose that'll be your job to find out. In essence, he was telling me that the work of ethnic studies was not only to look at those archives that others didn't want to touch, but also that our political and ethical imperative demanded that I search through archives that I'm afraid to touch. I was afraid to ask this question about an Asian American literary renaissance in an age of neoconservatism because I was afraid that I'd lose my innocence as a budding Asian Americanist scholar. But ethnic studies has taught me to go where there is danger, that innocence is a fiction that is ultimately a bankrupt place to be. The scholars who've come before us have modeled for me the ethic that if we don't go to those places that are most fearful and terrible, who else will? Lately, I've been thinking through the archives that I'm now most afraid to touch. And funny enough, this archive is one that I'm almost too familiar with, so much so that I've laughed at it. I've begun to venture into the arena of the Korean American sermon with quite a bit of apprehension. I'm trying to raise questions about the Korean American sermonic mode because for years I laughed at it. Laughter, Min Song writes in a very different context, is one response to this dread. I laughed at the dread of the Korean American sermon from what I considered to be a mode of oratory and communication that I rather resented being subjected to and was glad to be released from. Like a bad Hegelian, I relegated the sermon to the bin of childish foolishness, shorn myself of the fictions that obfuscates a broader, wiser version of the world and how it works. In many ways, I felt that the sermon was an example of why the world was so damn bad. And those who continued to attend the churches of my childhood, continued to lug Bibles every Sunday, continued to sit for hours enduring the long-winded screeches of a gesticulating man exerting all kinds of invective on his audience, I thought these people were hopelessly trapped in time, psychic development arrested. I laughed at what I had heard throughout much of my life because I dreaded that should I actually hear the sermon after my laughter dies down, I might actually listen. I don't have the numbers to back up this claim, and I know that my chair really likes numbers, so I apologize in advance. I don't have the numbers to back up this claim, but I speculate, and it's kind of a running joke within Asian American studies, that folks are just a little bit sick of Korean Americans doing research on their church. We all know the statistics. Amongst Asians and Asian Americans, Koreans and Korean Americans constitute the highest percentage of those who attend a church or identify as Christian. If every dissertation on Korean American churches were published, it would quickly overwhelm the 2 shelves of spaces allocated to Asian Americans in our bookstores. And thank God they are not all published. While other groups struggle to find people to enter ministry, Koreans and Korean Americans swell divinity schools and theological seminaries all over the U.S. Outside the United States, Korea sends the largest number of missionaries around the world. It has overtaken the UK. Why then I'm interested in this subject was best articulated by my friend Min Song as I was struggling to find words to express what remains still an inchoate set of ambivalences. He said something along the lines of, whenever I hear someone preaching, even if I don't understand what's being said, I can feel it. There is, in his mind, a shape to the rhetoric of the Korean American sermon that makes words corporeal, that, like poetry and music, reaches beyond our rational faculties and brings us to that place of our deepest desires and deepest dreads. There isn't, at least not yet, documentary evidence for this feeling. The feeling itself is the empiricism. The timbre of the voice, the performative wave of the hand, the intonation of scriptural recitation. There is a shape to the Korean American sermon that, like all oratory and rhetoric, expresses the palimpsest of a history of cultural contact and struggle that takes in and recreates the words of the profane and the sacred, what Korean Americans hear on city streets and how those sounds correlate to what they hear when they open their well-marked Bibles. Living and dying in the United States, they come on Sundays as damaged people, sometimes hurt in ways that they don't yet realize, and hope that the fictions offered them at that moment on Sunday will give solace, just enough to carry on throughout the week, words healing flesh. Like millions of other Americans, Korean Americans have been reading, or rather listening to literature by attending weekly church services, the centerpiece of which is the sermon. As in their 17th and 18th century counterparts, contemporary Korean Americans ask and answer their racial, class, gender, and national questions of belonging by filtering them through a complex interaction of profane and sacred time, weekday capitalism, and weekday liturgy. Scholars in Asian American studies and literary criticism oftentimes consider the contemporary sermon little more than an exposition of fundamentalist principles, an anachronistic reinforcement of literalism in our age of floating signifiers. Perhaps. But perhaps a revisitation of the sermon within Asian American literary studies may reveal that in the communal attempts to make corporeal ancient Hebrew and Greek texts in Korean American contexts, word made flesh, we might discover new understandings of literacy with all its messiness and ambivalence that evince a deeper dialectic at what it means to be an attentive American reader of the 21st century, flesh made word. My laughter at the sermon, then, is a response to this kind of dread, that there remains something compelling, even dangerous, about this literary form that still makes me pause when I hear on early Sunday mornings as I flip TV channels while perusing my LA Times and drinking my coffee. This is not to say that there's a singular Korean American homiletic. Some preachers are flat, some are wild, some sermons are painfully like business reports, others meander from story to story with no end in sight. Most of them are long by American standards. While the camera is mostly focused on the minister, occasionally there's a cutaway to the audience, those sitting, some sleeping, quietly as the man plods on. It strikes me at these momentary glimpses of the listeners as I imagine the scene reproduced over and over across the United States that I am witnessing at least a provisional answer to a question that Hisaye Yamamoto once asked, perhaps of her own work. She asked, does literature have any impact on what goes on day to day? Within these spaces and in these moments, when a Korean American sermon is delivered and heard, the answer is yes, but not in the ways that we in Asian American literary studies have often imagined or even want. And I'd like to move on to talk about the symposium now. The talks presented throughout these 2 days suggest as a whole that a departure is happening. Each of the presentations mark in its particular way a sense that a previous way of looking at the subjects of our study needed new lenses, a different slant of light. Whether that study is about sexuality or stereotype, agency or ethics, politics that inform our sense of power and resistance, and those practices that exceed these terms. In one sense, the often unwritten and unspoken audience in these papers are those who have come before us in our field. Stories begin so that another can end, or in a word, this symposium is about the generations of ethnic studies. But as Chef Chang has put it recently, generations are fictions. They are conveniences that allow us to mark time and space as bounded, contained, and, excuse the shift in dimensional metaphor, linear. And generations are a poor way of talking about the urgency, or better yet, the danger that ethnic studies speaks to. And here Walter Benjamin helps us. And many of you know this quote, but it bears worth repeating. To articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. For historical materialism, it is a question of holding fast to a picture of the past, just as if it had unexpectedly thrust itself in a moment of danger on the historical subject. The danger threatens the stock of tradition as much as its recipient, for both it is one and the same, handing itself over as a tool of the ruling classes. In every epoch, the attempt must be made to deliver tradition anew from the conformism which is on the point of overwhelming it. Danger is cross-generational. It exposes the fiction of generations, because the flash of memory that we may catch in that moment of danger tells us we've been here before. We speak about present danger that is a repetition with a difference, and unlike the public declarations after 9/11 of, you remember this, everything has changed, nothing will ever be the same anymore, we remind ourselves in ethnic studies we've been here before this encounter with danger. For me, reading the Korean American sermon now helps me frame the danger as one that is not out there, though it certainly is out there, but also one that is deeply embedded in and indeed constitutive of the work that we do. Viet Nguyen calls this the ethical impulse that undergirds the critical work in Asian American studies, the recognition of our capacity to claim our hurt, but also to hurt. Nguyen reminds us of what Avery Gordon calls the social, an acknowledgement that within each act of movement of liberation and freedom are the ghostly presences of enslavement and domination. And they invite us to look at the specters we create and hold up as models of how to live justly, and reckon with the disturbing realization that in the midst of our most radical rebellion, sometimes we're still saying the Pledge of Allegiance, although I'm not quite sure what language we're saying it in anymore. There is no measurable outcome to this work then. There are no guarantees to either theory or practice. We desire that which we ceaselessly critique because we realize that when we start new stories, not so much to end an old story, but to end a sad one. Generations are fictions because the moment of danger is a place where we've all been. We've been to these places that terrify us, that threaten the contours of our subjectivities, and ethnic studies teaches us, you must go back there again. Danger haunts us, and in recognizing the shadow that enables and fetters our critical imaginations, perhaps we might better recognize the work of justice, that deep confrontation with that which we most fear. And in doing so, the ceaseless dialectic of critique and recovery, perhaps we will continue to look out that window and find ourselves watching someone else watching us, and wonder whether there is indeed a look of recognition in both our faces. Thank you.
Today, my essay, Street Strollers, is my effort to merge theory and practice. It's a way to name how women in Harlem, New York during the 1920s and 30s developed their ideas via public spaces, and most specifically, the streets. The streets of Harlem offered individuals outside the academy methods to gather narrative forms such as stories and poems, songs, personal testimony, and even the Socratic method of questioning. Through the work of street scholars, and as street scholars, I'm primarily talking about individuals committed to political progressive change, we can witness the dynamic fusion between theory and practice. Street scholars' ideas and expressions are often delivered with the conviction of a prophet. Not only do they move us, but they move us to act. And given the nature of our gathering today, I think my meager offering to the conversation is the need for ethnic studies scholars to connect with individuals outside of the academy. Because usually these thinkers are developing cutting-edge ways to improve the lives of people who lack resources to live well in capitalist America. Street strollers as political organizers, I'm going to be highlighting two individuals, Amy Ashwood Garvey and Ella Baker. And both of these women represent the epitome, in my opinion, of street scholars. Their political leadership and social commentary provide a window into the Harlem freedom struggle during the 20s and 30s. I'm going to push that down just a little bit. The Life of the Street is the primary text for street scholars who are involved with the reports and experiences of living people. The 1920s cultural upsurge created an atmosphere that allowed stepladder speakers to occupy busy street corners, and political meetings and lectures took place all over town. Ubiquitous human voices resounding with the varieties of tone, tenor, and political perspective echoed from the streets of Harlem and into the hearts and souls of Black people during the 20s and the 30s. An exciting political spectacle was being staged on the streets of Harlem, and it was so inviting and enticing that Amy Ashwood Garvey and Ella Baker could not deny themselves the pleasure of being a part of it. Both women had rebuffed traditional expectations of Black womanhood by becoming street strolling scholars in Harlem. Capturing the essence of street strolling, James Weldon Johnson has written, quote, "Strolling in Harlem does not mean merely walking along Lenox or Upper 7th Avenue or 135th Street. It means that those streets are places for socializing," end of quote. I would add that those streets were also a place to mature intellectually. Given the time frame that I have, I'm primarily going to focus in on Ella Baker. But I want to talk a little bit about this whole concept of street strolling. And here I take my cues from dance theorists. I think one of the most important and exciting aspects of being in ethnic studies is the fact that we feel that we can flex outside of our traditional methodology. So I like to read across the disciplines, and particularly dance theorists. Amy Ashwood Garvey appeared on the streets of Harlem in 1918, while Ella Baker started stepping out in 1927. With its leisurely pace, strolling, a stylized repetition of walking allowed them to take in whatever was being said from corner to corner. Now, my historical imagination is about to jump in at this point, okay? Like dance, street strolling was an elaborate cultural practice developing into a Harlem fine art. As a structured movement, successful strolling includes mastering a set of protocols. For example, one has to make contact with others, position one's body to hear, and be able to calculate the value of information one is encountering. Being prepared for shifting ground tactics, i.e. heated arguments in the streets, demands a focused lens and a willingness to re-strategize an idea. Crowded, dynamic streets engendered a certain quickness of mind. The street strollers like Amy Ashwood Garvey and Ella Baker had to master the intellectual skill of thinking on their feet. Clearly, the choreographic dimensions of street strolling help to build an imagined community, one that articulates both individual and collective identities, and in the case of these women, political identities as well. Although Amy Ashwood Garvey and Ella Baker had different political agendas, both understood the importance of gathering information from the ground and sharing it with others. Challenging the dichotomization of verbal and nonverbal cultural practices, street strolling asserts a thought-filledness of movement and the theoretical potential of bodily action. This performative act has the capacity to produce a text and a text capacity to body forth a theoretical and political orientation. For both of them, strolling became a way of knowing. Now I'm just going to focus exclusively on Ella Baker. Miss Ella Baker was a valedictorian at her class at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Baker had set her sights on attending the University of Chicago for graduate work, but lack of funds and a family there put an end to that dream there. So in the hot, muggy summer of 1927, when relatives in New York City offered her a place to stay, Baker seized the opportunity, reasoning that, quote, one could make it easier with nothing in New York. Baker's initial street stroll was for the purpose of securing a job, since her prized undergraduate degree did not cushion her from racist hiring practices. As a result, Baker resorted to waitressing, and when she was lucky enough to she found factory work. Keeping her inquisitive ear to the ground, however, Baker soon discovered the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, and she said it was there that she began to learn some things. Joanne Grant, the first biographer of Ella Baker, was also her close friend, and she reports that Baker, quote, pursued her education in the streets of New York, end of quote. On the weekends, she would stroll Harlem, meeting friends and listening to, quote, a groundswell of ideas surrounding her, end of quote. Undertaken initially to find a job, street strolling soon became a pleasurable pastime for Baker and a rigorous method of gathering information that would become a part of her future intellectual arsenal. Respectfully and affectionately known as Miss Baker, she went all over town, quote, everywhere there was a discussion, with the determination to supplement her formal education. She later recalled that, quote, if you hadn't stood on the corner of 135th and 7th Avenue protesting and debating, you weren't in, end of quote. At times, she says, quote, she was the only woman there, sometimes the only black person, but I didn't care, she said, I was there to learn. Fortunately, the safe community of Harlem allowed her to stroll the streets until 3 a.m. Having a keen understanding of the differences between her formal study and her education gained from strolling the streets, Baker said, quote, I had never heard any of the discussions about social revolution because basically Shaw University was run by Northern Baptist Convention and they were classically inclined. Essentially, Baker, when she talks about Shaw University, she underscores how Shaw was a haven of an elite formal education, and it was on the streets of Harlem that she was able to reveal the shortcomings of her own prestigious college study, and also it provided keys for her to extend her knowledge. She said, quote, "The ignorant ones like me, we had lots of opportunities to learn and hear about theories and planks and organizations in Harlem." By the time of the Great Depression in 1929, Miss Baker would have witnessed the magnitude of poverty and privilege commingling in the same space. Baker recalled that, quote, "The tragedy of seeing long lines of people standing, actually waiting on bread lines for coffee and other handouts," end of quote. It was during this time period that Baker really began her political organizing. And armed with the knowledge that she had acquired from strolling the streets, Baker began her political organizing career aimed at developing the grassroots for group-centered leadership. As Baker explains, quote, "I have always thought what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as developing leadership among other people," end of quote. Charles Payne insightfully credits that Baker's most persistent idea, this notion of group-centered leadership, was produced during the 1930s. And this is very, very important for her future work. Now, Barbara Ramsby, who is her second biographer, who recently wrote a wonderful book, argues that from Baker's perspectives, quote, "readings, discussions, forums, and lectures were just as important to a movement for social change as mass protests, boycotts, and strikes," end of quote. Moreover, as a street-strolling intellectual, Baker recognized that these activities, which were predicated on engaging the black masses, presented a form of collective theorizing. Street-strolling theorizing depends on the life of the street and can be pursued through a variety of forms. But Miss Baker was especially fond of the Socratic method of questioning. That is, she asked hard questions to push the dialogue and thus the political convictions of those with whom she worked. I'm just going to highlight one particular piece of Miss Baker to kind of show how theory and practice are merging and how she's able to gather information from the street that's going to have a far-reaching political purpose. In addition to progressive political organizing, Miss Baker wrote political commentary for a variety of local newspapers and magazines. Her most cited essay, "The Bronx Slave Market," was co-authored with communist Marvell Cook and was published in The Crisis in 1935, and The Crisis was the magazine of the NAACP. In the theorizing of Baker and Cook, this essay opens with a series of questions. The Bronx slave market, what is it? Who are the dealers? Who are the victims? What are the causes? How far does the stench spread? What forces are at work to counteract it? Baker and Cook go on to describe the plight of black women domestics huddled on Simpson Avenue before sunrise, waiting for white lower middle class housewives to, quote, buy their strength and energy for an hour, 2 hours, or even a day for the small sum of 15, 20, 25 cents an hour. I'm hoping that this description should conjure up present day images of workers forced to sell their labor power on the corners and streets. One of the things that Baker also points out is that many of these black women were forced to raise up their dresses so that their knees would show. If one's knees were scuffed up, it was evident that you were willing to work on your hands and knees. Now, after observing these women negotiate their livelihood and asking them to questions regarding their work history, Baker and Cook wrote an illuminating article on how race sorely impacted the daily lives of working class black women, and also exposed to the largely black middle class readership of The Crisis the reality of capitalism. In this article, they also point out the unforeseen collective strength if these black women would organize. This signature article was informed by knowledge gleaned literally from the streets. After publication, Ms. Baker presented a copy of the essay to New York City Councilman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. asking for a address. I think this is another clue in terms of our conversation, that we have to make sure that our scholarship isn't exclusively for us, and that this scholarship can be used to truly change the lives of the people that we're writing about. In conclusion, the life of the mind does not require an academic baptism, as the political organizing and intellectual theorizing of Ella Baker and Amy Ashwood Garvey makes compellingly clear. Street strolling scholars plow the ground and seed numerous ideas for many academic intellectuals like ourselves to follow. Moreover, street scholars are renewed by moving about the streets. In this way, the street becomes a place or a space of enunciation. Strollers follow the complexity of the urban text and are grounded in the political activism of their days. As visionary, street-strolling thinkers not only touch our hearts and minds and souls, but improve the political and material conditions of our lives. When theory merges with practice, it goes beyond the ivory towers of scholars, awakening our consciousness to embrace revolutionary action through lived experiences in what academic theorists like ourselves often try to do from our often distant vantage point as we look on something that we call the real world. Thank you.
I'm very enthusiastic about the spirit that created the conference and has conceived of the journal as a place to rethink and assess where we are. I have to say that I don't travel to a lot of conferences during the year. I try to limit it, and I had just come back from the second within 3 weeks, I think. But when I saw the flyer, the email flyer, I immediately, my heart just jumped, and I felt it was, I don't know why, I just felt it was important that I needed to do it. And I think that is because in my spirit and in my body, I've been feeling for a long time that we need to stop and reassess. Especially the 90s, from the 90s through the present. I think a lot has changed. And for myself, I've paused many times and maybe tried to think about certain parts of it with others or myself because of what my body is telling me and my spirit is telling me. And so these really are preliminary thoughts, but I was grateful for the opportunity that you created in creating this conference to be able to finally sit down and say, aha, there's an official space to officially do this work in the midst of so much busyness. I think the last observation that I couldn't help but to have about this was that, you know, I'm not going to present on my work today, which is on decolonizing spiritualities and aesthetics. But anyway, and today, I mean, I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about that work, even though I love that work. Because this is an important conversation, but what I was reflecting on was that it's so interesting that the first paper I ever wrote, and periodically throughout my life as a scholar, over and over, my so-called scholarly work gets interrupted by the need to stop and analyze politically where I am and where we are. And, you know, so that makes for a really kind of interesting, weird, but absolutely necessary set of publications. So today's thoughts then, you know, on some preliminary, thinking around the lessons of the backlashes of the 90s and what we maybe can learn about that, thinking that I hope is grounded in a centering of women of color and male and female queer realities and positions. So I think that one of the things that I think is important is that we connect the liberal and neoliberal investment in whiteness, as Professor Lipsitz, has so eloquently explored in his book, that we connect this investment in whiteness with ongoing white privilege, that we connect that to the idea of the false autonomy of the subject of color, according to prominent critics who are very serious and are also allies like Wendy Brown and a host of other thinkers. I think we need to connect how does white investment figure in that criticism, well-meaning as it may want to be, and in the framing of that criticism and that question. For us as people of color, we are constantly reminded of the falseness of the liberal contract. Exceptions would be the exceptional, culturally capitalized, upper middle class and above ethnic minorities. Though wealth still might not stop men of color who look and act too ethnic from being pulled over, as I was once while driving with one of my Puerto Rican colleagues, a professor, though he has been harassed by campus police at UC Berkeley, who were not very impressed when he tried to interrupt them by pulling out his UC Berkeley ID. The insane thing is that we have a multiracial police force on campus headed today by a woman. Post-identity politics critique has been informed by and absorbed into the liberal paradigm, and anti-affirmative action on campus has returned us to awarding diversity scholarships openly now to and tenured track positions openly now to few U.S. oppressed ethnic minorities. What Richard Rodriguez did do that I like was to criticize his own sense of unnecessarily awarded scholarship in spite of what actually was a working class background. But many Latin Americans or longtime U.S. Latino residents raised by professional parents have no trouble accepting these hard-won gains by oppressed ethnic minorities. And it is they, in many cases, who are the undisaggregated body count of so-called Chicano Latino faculty. At UC Berkeley, in the College of Arts and Sciences, I am the only Chicana in the tenure track system. We have no out queer, Chicana, or Chicano, or other oppressed Latino faculty, although I have recently learned we have one mixed race colleague that counts some kind of Latino background, as part of our mixed race. Early deaths, like those of Barbara Christian, and illness due to stress and lack of sufficient recognition and support are still true on campus today, as is a renewed logics of disrespect for our persons and our work. The Berkeley Diversity Research Initiative, which I think is on this campus just called the Research Diversity Initiative or some scramble of that, the acronym, the BDRI, the BDRI on our campus has chosen to emphasize diversification of non-traditional fields of scholarship, potentially, but not necessarily through people of color, let alone through women, let alone through queer scholars themselves being hired. But the plea itself, on the basis of further diversification of campus faculty, is not the chief criteria, nor is the plea that ethnic studies fields need to be stabilized and then grow because we continue to produce the interpretive paradigms regarding multiculturality and even now in a globalized world. It is important that we lay claim to our historical and present intellectual contributions, given their appropriations and reinterpretations by even progressive dominant culture identified scholars. For example, the post-identity critique and its actual practices, and yet the ongoing failure to recognize the contribution that ethnic studies are making to us all. Why should a Chicana feminist scholar's work be characterized as relevant only to this field, refusing to acknowledge its contribution to international feminist studies? Yet feminist work focused on Euro-American culture continues to assume universal significance in spite of the critiques of, and debates of the mid-'80s and mid-'90s that show that it is, in fact, Eurocentric and therefore parochial. During the UC Berkeley Ethnic Studies strike of 1999, a leftist colleague told me she was tired of our complaints and demands and didn't want to hear it. A unanimous ethnic studies faculty joined the undergraduate and graduate coalition, otherwise abandoned, however, by both the campus and Berkeley liberal and progressive communities. Campus lectures are basically segregated events. Few colleagues show up to ethnic studies events outside of our own departments and programs. Women's studies colleagues rarely attend Chicana Latina lectures Funding decisions have been made on the basis of dominant cultural ignorance of the importance of our scholars, precisely because they don't feel the necessity to inform themselves of third world and Native American perspectives, either here or elsewhere. Inequality continues. Quote-unquote liberal exhaustion and backlash against feminist, oppressed ethnic minorities and oppressed ethnic minority studies in particular still characterizes our moment. However, I also think that we must also figure into this equation the break in coalitionary mentality among ethnic studies allies, or perhaps put another way, the re-emergence of our own class, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality contradictions and privileges that are buttressed by white liberal and leftist exhaustion. This is how I see it. At UCB in Ethnic Studies, which is composed by 4 undergraduate programs, Asian American Studies, Comparative Ethnic Studies, Native American Studies, and Chicano Latino Studies, and at the grad level we have the Comparative Ethnic Studies with faculty from AFAM as well. At UCB, we have experienced between a few, I want to be very careful, not between all of our colleagues, but between a few vocal, a reemergence in intra-ethnic racism, open jockeying for power over the other, binary logic dismissals on the basis of gender, marginalization and erasure of the importance of gender and queer studies, an ongoing straight boys network politics over and against feminist and queer agendas, and a retreat from principled practice around appearance and culture. I have been told or exposed to negative remarks about other faculty within ethnic studies on the basis of their appearance, slender versus heavy, culturally racist assumptions around the poor quality and laziness of one group's scholarship over the other, and the marginalization and sidetracking of feminist and queer courses have elicited reactionary anti-male discourse. We have also had reactionary feminist anti-male discourse. Against the decolonized politics of an interdisciplinary comparative ethnic studies program, I've also seen the reproduction in some of our younger scholars of a backward anti-humanities, anti-cultural studies stance that negatively feminizes and stereotypes literary, cultural, and visual studies and post-structural, post-colonial feminist and queer studies theories as unserious with respect to social sciences, a kind of a macho, real hard work, empirical approach in social sciences and history versus the rest of us. In this way, these young scholars fall into the post-Enlightenment, gendered and sex division of labor in the university with the unwittingly unacknowledged use of theory and interpretive apparatuses largely culled in the former feminized fields as raw material to be benefited from. Literary, artistic, and other visual cultural study and the study of our different communities' culturally different religiosities are not insignificant cosas de viejas y maricones, things, matters for broads and effeminates. Our people's and our culture's survival across 500 years of colonization and its after effects into modern day racisms, sexisms, and heteronormativities, and white privilege and Euro-American cultural, political, and economic hegemonies has been significantly predicated through our stories, home altars, communal faith, and I can't read my writing, and communal faith and similar cultural practices, recording, preserving, passing on, translating into modern day forms our ancestral supposedly destroyed cultural ways, i.e. quote-unquote differences, that is from the monolithic Euro-American perspective. I think that we've been trying to better understand and to live with and negotiate difference across alliance and coalition, not only to broaden canons into the truly more universal rather than the fake universal of the Eurocentric, patriarchal, heteronormative, but to begin the work of decolonizing the epistemological frameworks structuring the definition, production, and dissemination of what even gets to count as knowledge in the great post-Enlightenment shakedown of a racialized, gendered, and sexed university and its disciplinary divisions. The creation of different oppressed ethnic, gender, and sexuality programs and departments as a consequence of the first wave of civil rights struggles in the 20th century can be read from our colleague Chela Sandoval's framework as a globalizing response to domination, to global domination, a globalizing response to a globalizing domination. The coalitionary politics between different ethnic and other oppressed groups in the US across national borders was part and parcel of that era's radical democratic anti-racist civil rights logic, not an after effect thanks to Euro-American critics of identity politics. We must tell our own histories against that projection of a caricature of who we are as native and third world peoples in the US and elsewhere. My knowledge, in part, of the 60s and 70s Chicano movement is published as an account that shows the simultaneity of the emergence of the Chicano and feminist lesbian movements from point go, and from a clear understanding of the imbrication of race, class, gender, and sexuality, that these were not dominant agendas, feminism and sexuality, within the Chicano movement is a different question. Chicana feminism and Chicana lesbian feminism did not arise after exposure to Euro-American feminism or queerness with the well-known writers of the 80s. Nor did we have a simple-minded idea of unity across cultural, regional, and class differences in Chicano nationalism. It is the sad irony of the knowledge power configurations of our time to see our own younger generation scholars hop onto the post-identity bandwagon as post-Chicanos, for example, without understanding the false narrative and straw man critique at the heart of the ruse of the post-identity so-called debate. The post-identity critique is, to me, a condescending, missionary-style ruse of the progressive, liberal, and conservative ideological spectrum of dominant Euro-American culture. Who, and of course not all Euro-American scholars identify with it, who, if not we, know that we are more than the labels foisted on us through histories of racism and subjugation and subordination in various spheres? Who, if not we, know that negatively conceived labels dehumanize and discipline us in unholy, raced, classed, gendered, sexed orders? Because of what we know through lived experience, as Sandoval and others have argued, ours has been a politics, including a politics of identity, long characterized as strategic, mobile, fluid, and oftentimes ironic with regard to dominant orders. We once again need coalition against resegregation and redisciplining, now through the argument that we need other, deeper, smarter ways to organize ourselves in ethnic, sexual, or gender oppressions. 1960s and 70s Chicana feminists, like African American feminists, refusal to abandon larger community issues into anti-male of color stances already embodied a politics attending their observation of the simultaneity of gender, class, and race and sexual oppressions. I see a complex politics of simultaneity of oppressions reduced to the Euro-American predicament as if it were natural to assume the latter's ethnocentric conundrum were universally true of the purportedly less enlightened, less educated, and less intellectually sophisticated quote-unquote races. Then a quote-unquote solution provided that surreptitiously learns its lessons from the US, Native, and Third World women of color and queer critique of white feminism as a new solution for a new moment, the post-ID critique. And our work characterized as ethnocentric, narrow, and merely provincial, too narrowly focused on identity. As if Euro-dominated studies, that is the university in general as we know it, is not itself heavily about the identity of Euro-American cultures, and these in turn hierarchically ordered themselves. As Chakrabarty has observed, the necessity of showing Europe's actual provincialism. It sounds like cultural monocultivation of the internal and external indigenous and third worlds intellectually. The effort is made to insert us in a global intellectual economy of producers of one or two raw or monocultures, such as coffee, sugar, bananas, and precious metals, that are then manufactured elsewhere, originally in the first world, and returned to us as products for purchase. But it is vital in this economy that characterized the imposition of an economic and political cultural world order that we not control the production process of manufactured goods, which in this case is theory. To me, decolonization involves this sort of critique and the reading and citing of each other, and the expose and deauthorization of dominant culture's guise of superior analytic powers, but more positively, the development and creation or theorization of what our communities know and do to survive, thrive, create, and pass on knowledge, fight the institutionalized evils of various discriminations and subjugations, and crucially produce new models of abiding visions for a better way of being, otro modo de ser, both that we remember from our different cultural archives interrupted by the imperialist, colonialist, and capitalist and sexually and gender subordinating orders, and that we imagine now with our third eyes. We know things older than Freud and Saldúa mocked in Borderlands. And I add, dominant culture does not control all spaces. We are not inescapably, hopelessly, always already within dominant cultures without recourse to the spirit, hunger, and drive for deeper, deepest freedom in our desires, and no, not merely envious desire to be the consumerist and white male liberal think-alike, if not look-alike. The decolonial turn of the present, as we have put it at a conference in UCB last spring, is partly about building strong networks between third world and indigenous scholars here and abroad who are progressive, of better, good Lord, again, I can't read, of better integrating our own historic and ongoing ethnic and racial fusions as increasingly mixed race peoples and multicultural societies, at least in the first world global capitals, of actively, generously recognizing and supporting and reading each other and our communities and working with ourselves, each other, and our larger communities through practices we think through from decolonizing perspectives. Our first generation of Chicana and African American and Native American and Asian American feminist scholars have been retiring and dying early. Our younger ones sometimes killing themselves or dropping out. Who is to replace them? Who will stand by women and queers of color, regardless of our own gender and sexualities, and demand a little bit of affirmative action for us? This is a key and grounding step in a meaningful, tactical identity politics aimed at social justice and the decolonization of gender and sexuality along with race relations that undermines the literality of the term identity politics, and where we are all lesbian men and women of color Spartacuses.
I too am also excited about the conference and being invited. And since I'm a discussant rather than a formal presenter, I feel I have the right to sit, and it followed through with part of the title. It said conversation, so I'm going to sit rather than stand. And I didn't get a chance to see any of the papers, And one of the challenging roles of a discussant is to be coherent, I think, and pull together the threads of the various papers. And since I didn't get to do that, I'm going to improvise a bit, but I think I have enough to work on. And what time framework should we be working with in terms of when you want to have the Q&A?
3:45 is the break.
So...
No, sorry, that was with Rosalinda's turn. Yeah.
So how much time would you like for me to take? 10, all right. I'll do that. I think one of the things that it's been pointed out earlier, and is also through many of the papers which are outstanding, that one of the enduring legacies, although it's very fragile and has not been without obstacles, are the ethnic studies programs in the various universities, whether they're set up as departments or whether they're set up as research centers. And because a lot of students these days actually are unaware of the struggles in the 60s, first of all, and they are unaware of the really concrete gains because they are growing up in a climate where many of those gains have been eroded, have been attacked, and yet one enduring legacy that continues to stand are the ethnic studies programs, and they have not been without their attacks either, and I don't think we should take them for granted. As part of the struggle against colonialism, one of the things I hear, and that what I want to sort of contribute, is maybe adding some nuance to some of the terminology, because I work in the area of theory, and we tend to think that way conceptually, that part of the decolonial process in that early phase was an anti-colonial struggle, a struggle against colonialism, and may have necessarily been premised on essentialism as a strategy for mobilization. And in the era in which the programs all emerged and when ethnic studies was under siege in the large academy, even after it was implemented, this strategy made complete sense. Essence and essentialism is often used strategically, so this is not at all new. But I would argue that one of the things I'm hearing through the papers today, and I'm sure the ones that have preceded and the ones that will follow, that part of the decolonial process has to also move beyond anti-colonial strategies of strategic essentialism. And George Lipsett's colleague in the Black Studies Department and Chela and Chicano Studies have different ways of articulating what I feel is critical to achieving that, and I've heard it mentioned in various ways today: strategic anti-essentialism, and in Chela's terminology, radical mestizaje. And essentially what that allows is for ethnic studies to move beyond the logical, though limited, goals of strategic essentialism and anti-colonial struggle, to move genuinely towards a post-colonial struggle in which not only do the ethnic studies programs see their links with other departments through their interdisciplinary focus and are actually able to build multi-ethnic coalitions, but are also able to see the interlocking nature, as many of the papers today have mentioned, between sexism and homophobia in those programs, as well as in the larger academy, and then also the link that a sort of strategic anti-essentialism allows you is to see the links outside the academy, and that whether people want to admit it or not, that scholarship for most of the people I know that are involved in ethnic studies is based on the authority of experience. And the academy likes to pretend that it is based on objectivity, but I say taking that position is a subjective position anyway, so where do we go? There's no way you can get out of it. So clearly, the role of ethnic studies continuing its mission is to move in a direction where the fuzziness of boundaries and the links not only between disciplines and various ethnic studies discourses, but those also linking up with feminist studies and queer studies. And we could go down a long list of issues to talk about that. Given the dangers in our current climate, I think current climate is vigilance is even more critical, because the anti-colonial struggle was a critique of colonialism, which was based on very gross, very obvious domination. But since the 70s, and certainly since the 90s, with the Reagan Bush 1 and Bush 2, that sort of, shall we say, some of the gains have been bushwhacked from the 60s. And so clearly, The dangers of a neo-colonial decolonization are always hovering there. And because it sort of parades as inclusion or hypocritical democracy, as Nelson was talking about in Latin America, and uses colorblindness and links and fuzziness as a way of dismantling coalitions, actually, we need to be very vigilant in this colorblind era, actually, as we struggle towards post-colonial fuzziness and links of a variety of different kinds, to be aware of the ability of certain powers to appropriate those kind of links to dismiss the need for specificity. And so clearly, ethnic studies needs to continue its earlier mission that emerged from the 60s about difference and multiculturalism and the unique threads that make up the tapestry of not only the United States, but ethnic studies also, but move towards a genuine transcultural and transracial discourse that not only will see the linkage of these various disciplines, but as I said earlier, move beyond the academy and continue to articulate the lived experience that scholars of color particularly are naive if they actually believe, and I don't think many do, that there's any such thing as objectivity in terms of why they're here. I think all of us who've been in the academy do want to see a more equitable world, and the luxury of seeing our scholarship as just something as part of the tenure process, which should not be underestimated by any means, is a danger, I think, that the current racial ecology would like to bank on. So, as a sort of a final statement, these conferences, like the ethnic studies programs, should not be taken for granted, and I think it's admirable. This is, I think, the second one, at least I'm aware of, that we've had here at UCSB, and I would say from my experience with our ethnic studies programs, that there is a genuine attempt, if always not successful, to really cross those walls between the ethnic studies departments. There are scholars working together, and our own sociology department here, which is the department I'm in, is, I understand, the most interdisciplinary sociology department in the country, which is really rather interesting given the really myopic nature of sociology. So in conclusion, I would say that certainly part of the decolonization really requires us to move from anti-colonial to post-colonial, really grounded in George Lipsitz's understanding of strategic anti-essentialism and Chela Sandoval's radical mestizaje, where we can see the power of links as a vehicle for radical anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-phobic struggle, as opposed to essentialism as only being a way of reducing people to singular kinds of categories, because nobody actually really fits in them if they really relay their experience.